Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, who is a distinguished scholar of Indian military history, and he is posted, if I am not wrong, at the National Defence College, New Delhi, a college, unfortunately, about which not many people in New Delhi have actually heard. So there is a National Defence College in New Delhi. It's not very far from here, it's close by. And he will be speaking to us on a very, very apposite and a very interesting topic, a topic with which all Indian military historians usually deal. It's called the neglect of modern Indian military history and its impact on our strategic culture. So there are two important things in this. Number one, he is first convinced of the fact that there is a modern Indian military history which has to be established in the first place, with all respect to your scholarship. The second important thing is that this modern Indian military history, if such a history exists, has been neglected by Indians, which is true. History in general is neglected by the Indians. So, since modern Indian history is part of history, I would suppose the same holds true for that as well. And then the third most important thing, which actually caught my eye when I looked at the flyer, impact on our strategic culture. Do we have a strategic culture? A big question. First, there must be a strategic culture for it to be impacted upon. So these are very interesting questions right in the beginning, which came to my mind when I was approached by the Nehru Memorial Museum to come here and chair his distinguished talk. And I think having carried out this very small deconstructive exercise of the topic of his very interesting sounding lecture, I think I will hand over the mic to him. And after he has spoken for about an hour, I think, do we have an hour? Does he get an hour? He is getting an hour to speak to us, and I'm looking forward very eagerly to what he has to say. I have on occasion spoken with him. I think we've spoken 3 or 4 times earlier, and he has held forth on a few issues in a very interesting and a very articulate manner. I think he's a very articulate scholar. And he's one of those rare military men, one of those rare Air Force officers who has taken military history very seriously. So please, over to you, and I welcome you once again.
Thank you very much, Professor Deshpande, for those very gracious words of yours, and I'd also like to thank the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you on a subject that, like he mentioned, has not been much of a flavor amongst the traditional Indian historical community. But before that, before I dive headlong into military history and strategic culture, I was in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago. And we happened to be in Vietnam on the 125th birth anniversary of Ho Chi Minh. And what we saw there actually amazed me and reinvigorated my conviction that military history is an important part of a nation's legacy. We went to military museums both in Ho Chi Minh City and in Hanoi. And we saw hundreds of school children thronging the museum. And when I asked a few teenagers as to what do you want to become when you grow up, not one of them said that we want to join the military. All of them said that we want to become doctors, we want to become engineers, we want to become IT professionals, exactly the trajectory that a fast developing and economically vibrant nation, the youth wants to do. Then I asked them, I said, then what are you guys doing in a military museum? And then they said, we are able to dream and we are able to aspire about what we want to do because of them. Because of Ho Chi Minh and because of General Giap, who between the two of them defeated the two of the world's most mightiest military powers over a matter of 20 years. That's France and the United States of America. And then when I looked around, I saw that the state had taken upon itself the responsibility of preserving that young nation's military history so meticulously that it has ingrained itself into the DNA of the people. And that's how the concept of a people's army in Vietnam has still exists. And that's because the people of Vietnam know their military history. 2 weeks later, or rather 1 week later, we headed north to Japan. Now, Japan, in all of our minds, has been a relatively benign and pacifist nation ever since World War II, after World War II, imposed as it has been with a lot of sanctions and a lot of restrictions on its articulation of force as a tool of statecraft. Its defense policy revolves around what it calls the spear and the shield. The shield is provided by Japan and the spear is provided by the United States. But there again, when we visited the memorials at Hiroshima and the military museum adjoining the Yasukuni shrine, which those of you who've been to Japan have visited, once again, I was struck by the number of young people and the number of common citizens thronging through the museums. And once again, when I asked them, I said, how come Japan, how come there's so much of interest in military history? They say the shoguns, the samurais, and the generals of World War II are part of our DNA. We may not be a militant nation. We may not subscribe to the use of force in plenty in the manner in which we did in World War II as a tool of statecraft. But we know that it is a tool of statecraft and that we need to nurture it. And we need to remember the exploits of Japan's military. And you look at how that is linked with Japan's recent activism or resurgence in the face of aggressive Chinese maneuvering in the region. The Japanese have no doubts that if push comes to shove, they will be able to respond militarily exactly in the manner in which they did in decades ago against the Chinese. So this is something about, so after my recent visit to Vietnam and Vietnam and Japan, I realized that it is a response that if a state nurtures, creates archives, nurtures the legacy of the military, not in a triumphalistic sense, but in the sense that it ensures that their legacy is ingrained in a nation's history. That's how a nation and its military history are one. And that's how strategic culture gets automatically meshed in with a nation's military history and not just its political and social history. Now, over the next 35 to 40 minutes or so, I think I'll share some thoughts with you on modern Indian military history and how I feel that it has been neglected within the traditional Indian historical discourse and how it has directly impacted our strategic culture. Now, some of the issues that I will flag are, I will briefly touch on what is my perspective on the scope of military history. Now, I've got an extremely learned history chair here. So my definition or my explanation of military history may not fit the bill of classic academic definitions, but nevertheless so. Then I will then try and explain or try and say as to why military history has been neglected over the years, modern Indian military history. Then I will try and touch upon a little bit about strategic culture and where it meshes with military history and how a neglect of military history impinges on it. Then I will touch upon something I'm sure is going to interest each and every one of you, and that is what are the various contradictions that I have seen that have emerged in modern India that has ensured or that has resulted in this neglect of military history. I will take a few case studies of lessons not learnt, which means to say certain lessons from the wars India has fought in the past, which had distinct strategic lessons for us, which we chose to ignore and suffered. Then I will talk a while what's the likely impact or perils of neglecting the study of military history. And, in case I have a little time, a few suggestions as to how we can navigate the way ahead through things that can actually be done. I mean to say deliverables, not something fancy. Right. Now a few personal perspectives, because this is a very, very varied audience, and honestly this is the first time that I'm addressing such a varied audience. My audience, many of the seminars I've spoken to have been primarily very formal military audiences, and therefore I think it is in order to tell you a bit about where I come from, as which will help you understand what I'm talking about. I'm not a right-wing historian, I'm not a left-wing historian, I'm not a liberal historian. I'm not even a military historian. I'm an aspiring military historian who is attempting to put together an honest and a decently researched study of India's modern wars from 1947 to current times. I grew up in a family which talked more about J. Krishnamurti, the philosopher. But from a very young age, I was very interested in military history. Arjuna, Achilles, Napoleon, Shivaji, Ranjit Singh, Patton, Eisenhower, these were my idols as I grew up. Honestly, I would have studied military history had there been an opportunity to do so in our country. But there wasn't no opportunity. So I did what I did. I joined the armed forces, became a fighter pilot, 31 years of hardcore fighter flying and a career in the Indian Air Force before I felt that it was time for me to go back to my passion of trying and investigating a little more about military history, and the military history that is not much written about military history after independence. Okay, let me look at, how do I look at, what is military history? Military history is not merely a study of battles, wars, or campaigns. Military history is also a study of societies and people under stress. Military history studies the baser issues of human instinct like fear, greed, resilience, ability to bounce back after disaster. The study of military history helps us look at ourselves as a country, or helps people look at themselves after they've been shattered by war and conflict. And therefore, if you look at it in a very, very holistic manner, military history actually impinges and influences political science, sociology, and public policy. And these days, most democracies talk about a holistic liberal education. And I feel that military history has to be part of a liberal historical discourse, because only then will it provide citizens with or only then are we able to produce informed and broadly read citizens. And that is why I feel that military history must be included even in a liberal historical education. Right. From military history, let me now move on to strategic culture. Now, strategic culture is again a term that has been beaten out of proportion by theorists across the world. Okay, we've had a number of extremely caustic and critical writings on India's strategic culture, and Professor Deshpande also queried as to whether India really has a strategic culture at all. So how do we look at strategic culture? Strategic culture, putting it very, very simply, is the orientation of a country and its people to the things that matter to it the most. And when I talk about things that matter to it the most, it would be governance, diplomacy, the economy, science and technology, and the use of force as a tool of statecraft. So if that is strategic culture, how do we fingerprint strategic culture? Very, very simply. You have terms like aggressive, You have terms like assertive. You have terms like pacifist. You have terms like meek. You have terms like status quo. And you have terms like revisionist. Now, these are all terms that have evolved over the years in political theory to classify a country and its strategic culture. And to give you an example, how would you look at China's strategic culture today? China, I would reckon, is assertive and revisionist. And how would you reckon India is today? And I'm talking about today, not the India of 2 years ago or not the India of 3 years ago. But the India of today, I would look at as confident and status quo. Who knows? In 10 years' time or in 5 years' time, this may change. But as of now, I would believe, based on on rapid change over the last 1 year, I would put my money that currently India's strategic culture is a confident one, but is still status quo, for the pure and simple reason that for a country to be revisionist in its strategic culture, it needs to develop the capacity and the capability to change the environment. And that is something that is a work in progress as far as India is concerned. So therefore, I think I'm slowly getting down to where does military history fit in? Let me talk about force. Ever since civilization was formed, force has been an acceptable or a very prevalent tool to resolve conflicts and disputes. When monarchies and nation states developed, force then became a tool of statecraft to achieve political objectives or as an instrument of policy. And then let me look at a different definition of military history. And if military history is the study of force application, we can say that military history is a study of structured force application in pursuit of political objectives or of state policy. And therefore, if you don't study military history continuously, constantly, and through different lenses, I don't think you can have informed policy or informed inputs that can influence policy. Now let me come to some contradictions in modern India. Okay? And before I talk about contradictions in modern India, I'd like to state up front here that these views are entirely my own and do not reflect the view of any organization that I belong to, whether it's the Air Force or the National Defense College or the Ministry of Defense, what have you. These are my personal views, and it must be taken as so. When India gained independence, it gained independence after a very well documented, very well orchestrated, and a highly acceptable non-violent freedom struggle. And I think with that, there can be no dispute. And the founding fathers of our nation felt that they had this tremendous opportunity at that moment in time to project and build India as this oasis of peace, of multiculturalism, multilinguistic communities, a liberal ethos, and a very altruistic approach to international relations. And what about military history and what about the military? Military history, in my study till so far, was considered to be a forgettable legacy of our colonial past. And therefore, after independence, whenever the structures for the study of history were established, somehow military history was never weaved in. And I think this was a flawed strategy. Because I don't think that is the entire story. I don't think the entire story of India's independence revolves around its non-violent and peaceful struggle. And let me tell you why. I'm sure many of you would be aware of the tremendous pressure on the Crown to leave India because of the large number of demobilized, trained soldiers and officers who were there in India after World War II. Auchinleck, the wise general that he was, is known to have advised both Churchill and Attlee that I think it's time for you to leave India. Otherwise, I don't know whether we will be able to cope with a second war of Indian independence, considering that there are millions of trained Indian soldiers demobilized in the villages and in the countries. And I don't think we will be able to stand another armed struggle by India's independence movement. Then, of course, we forget about the coercive effect of Subhash Chandra Bose and his Indian National Army on the freedom struggle. So while that has been documented a lot, but I do believe that we've erred at some point in time as to what could be the texture of our historical discourse. And I think that is something that we need to seriously look at. And that's one of the contradictions in modern India. And what is the contradiction? This is the contradiction. This is the contradiction that despite being this oasis of peace, multicultural, liberal democracy, look at the number of times since independence that force has had to be applied by the state to protect geographical and territorial sovereignty, as well as prevent our fissures and cracks from widening to such an extent that India doesn't get balkanized. How many times in the past have we heard political scientists say that India is a bomb waiting to explode? The balkanization of India is an inevitable reality. But then have we been balkanized till now? No, we haven't. This is probably one of the reasons why we have not been balkanized. J&K in 1948, and these 2 stars and 3 stars or 1 star indicate, a 1 star indicates wherever the Indian Army has been used, 2 star indicates wherever the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force has been used, and 3 stars indicate where the Indian Army, the Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy, all 3 have been used. Let's start off from Jammu and Kashmir in 1948. Are you aware that the historical community today still calls the Jammu and Kashmir camp as a conflict and not a war? Why is that so? Maybe sometime over a cup of coffee I'll ask Professor Deshpande as to why is it still called a conflict and not a war? Are you aware as to how many divisions were employed in Jammu and Kashmir? There was Thimaya's division in the Leh sector. There was Atma Singh's division in the Jammu sector. There were 2 Pakistani divisions assisting the raiders from across. There were 4 squadrons of the Indian Air Force who were operating. But why are we apologetic about not calling it a war? Hyderabad. Hyderabad is still called a police action. Was it a police action really? We had 2 Indian Army divisions led by an armored division heading for Hyderabad. General Chaudhary's 1 armored division and General Rudra's division coming from the south, from the Madras area. We had aircraft from Pune bomb Bidar airfield. But yet, we call it a police action. Why? Because I think in those times, we were apologetic about the use of force. We wanted to avoid force at all costs to integrate the nation. Very, 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 very laudable, no doubt, and it was a tremendous effort that there was only Junagadh, that there was only Hyderabad where force was used to amalgamate the state into the Indian Union. It was a tremendous effort, no doubt. But there was also force used. Junagadh. Now, Junagadh, there was no force used. But there was an entire task force, including the INS, including naval warships that were steaming towards Junagadh in case the Nawab of Junagadh refused to accede to the Indian Union. There were aircraft, there were fighter aircraft on standby in Jamnagar. There was an army unit, there was an army brigade ready to move into Junagadh in case the Nawab chose to accede to Pakistan. Wisely, he chose to head towards Karachi with his dogs and his mistresses on board. That's the story that goes. Goa, the Chinese conflict, Nagaland, India-Pakistan, Mizoram, Manipur, the Nathula skirmish, the 71 war, all the northeast insurgencies, Operation Blue Star, Operation Pavan, Operation Cactus, which was the intervention requested by a foreign country in Maldives, the proxy war in Jammu and Kashmir that has been going on since 1989, Operation Vijay and Safed Sagar, which was our Kargil war, the numerous UN operations from the early 50s onwards, wherein we have contributed very actively. At one stage, we were the largest contributors to UN operations. The numerous face-offs. I mean to say, Professor Deshpande was talking about how the border security force is on 24/7 alert across the, across the country. Similarly, all the army, most of the army units, in fact, all the army units on the international border, on the line of control and on the line of actual control, are on a state of 24/7 readiness. There are face-offs and encounters on a daily basis. Leave alone that. What about the Indian Navy? I mean to say, when the Indian Navy, in the aftermath of the Mumbai attacks, the Indian Navy is on constant alert across our extremely vast and porous coastline, along with the Coast Guard. And numerous face-offs, skirmishes, encounters, and of course the anti-Naxal operations, which thankfully and hopefully the armed forces don't get involved in. But still, the Indian Air Force is engaged in a supportive role. Primarily for casualty evacuation and humanitarian relief. So I mean to say, this doesn't actually paint a picture, does it not paint a picture of the requirement to chronicle these operations for posterity, so that the younger generation understands the importance, not only, I'm not talking about the importance of the armed forces, I am talking about as a military historian. Okay. Now, let me briefly look at some of the reasons for the neglect, what I believe are the reasons for neglect of military history. First is, I think I would endorse what Professor Deshpande says, that we really don't have much of a sense of history. Leave alone military history. History is actually a fairly neglected discipline within our academic discourse, and again it is understandable in a country that is developing, so lots of technological bias, and we are developing our economy rapidly, and it's understandable. It was seen in the United States also during the 50s and the 60s when nobody wanted to study history and they all wanted to study engineering and medicine. So it's a question of, it's a logical progress of a society. Thereafter, then we were talking about a reluctance to declassify and poor archival facilities. We are generally an opaque society. I'm not going to talk about government. I'm not going to talk about the three services. We are generally an opaque society, and that is across the board. And unless we are a little more transparent, unless we are able to learn from our mistakes, I was amazed. I just saw are times changing? I think times are changing. Today I saw a headline down below when I was spending some time in the library that Ratan Tata, barely a few years ago, after being the chief architect of the Nano project, admits openly in public that the Nano was a mistake. That the pricing of the Nano was a mistake. Now for Mr. Ratan Tata to admit it openly that it was a mistake requires tremendous amount of courage. So I think we are moving on as a society. I think we will, and I must mention that over the last 1 year, there have been tremendous amount of attempts to declassify, to make things more transparent, to revive, a thrust in the revival of military history. The centenary celebrations of World War I were supported tremendously by the government. And I remember having read a newspaper item soon after the new government took over, in which Mr. Arjun, when he was the defense minister, had called all the three chiefs and had spoken to them and told them that, look, I need a revival in military history. I want more writing on military history. So I think I think we're moving in the right direction, but like all things Indian, everything is going to be at its own pace. Then this is something which I think is a little sensitive, but I don't mind touching a sensitive chord here. That in the absence of modern Indian military history, I think the historical community in India has overplayed on the British legacy. For the pure and simple reason that there is a lot of archival material available about World War I, about World War II, about the impact of the British legacy on our army, and a whole lot of archival material is available here in India, it's available in Oxford, it's available in Cambridge, and the Brits openly say, come and research and write. Fair enough. But is that our actual military legacy? Some of it, yes. But what about Maharaja Ranjit Singh and what about Shivaji? That is actually the origins of the DNA of India's armed forces. Yes, the colonial legacy has left some good things and has had some bad things. But do we today need to concentrate so much on researching on India's pre-colonial military history? I think we need a rethink on that. I think we need a little more research on India's modern military history of wars and conflicts after independence. And to be very honest, the Ministry of Defence has come out with official histories. But these official histories are merely a structured record of battles, campaigns, and events. I mean, so these are the three books that I would recommend those of you who would like to research on them. You could look through them. Very, very comprehensive records of India's modern wars. But they are primarily for researchers. I would reckon that a young Indian or an informed citizen who wants to learn more about India's soldiers, sailors, and airmen and about the wars they fought will find this heavy reading. So what do you actually need? You need more narratives on modern Indian military history. You need more people-centric narratives about Indian military history. You need more narratives about Indian generals, admirals, and air marshals who have contributed significantly to peace and conflict. Yeah, okay. Now, I said that I would touch on some lessons not learnt. And I've picked on just about 4 or 5 lessons from some of India's wars after independence. And the first war that I'd like to pick on is on India's war, the Jammu and Kashmir conflict of 1947 and 48. Okay. Now, that was a war that was fought over 1 year across 3 fronts. We had a war going on in Dras, Kargil, Leh, along the Indus River towards Skardu and Gilgit. We had a war going on in the valley around Srinagar, Baramulla, Titwal, that particular area of Jammu and Kashmir. And we had a war going on in the Jammu sector. Poonch, Rajouri, some of the bloodiest battles were fought over there. And there were 3 lessons that I've taken from that war, which were not heeded by India's strategic establishment, and we paid for it in the years ahead. The first one, Poonch is a small town, or no longer a small town. It was a small town, 40,000 citizens. It was surrounded on all sides by Pakistani raiders for almost a month. Poonch was completely cut off from the country. There was a small military unit in Poonch, which later on expanded to about 2 battalions to a brigade. And there were 40,000 citizens of Poonch. And it took 1 year for the Indian army to lift the siege of Poonch. So what did the citizens of Poonch do during that time? They survived. They survived like the citizens of Berlin survived for 1 year. But what we have in the world are numerous discourses on the Berlin airlift. But we have nothing about the saga of Poonch. We have no narratives about Poonch. So what happened there? What we had were a bunch of soldiers, a band of courageous and intrepid airmen who maintained Poonch with Dakotas and other aircraft for a period of 1 year. And we had them teamed up together to keep hostile elements away from them for a year till a larger force of the Indian Army came and extricated the town from the siege. The lessons from Poonch were, and to my mind, the first lesson in civil-military relations in the country was the Siege of Poonch. We could have learnt a lot from there, but somehow we didn't. We had civil administrators in the town of Poonch, we had military men, and we had the citizens of Poonch who created a framework for themselves to not only survive, but to survive well for 1 year. But did we learn about civil-military relations from the saga of Poonch? I don't think so. I don't think we learnt enough. The second thing in 1947. I wonder whether most of you are aware that the entire infiltration strategy of the jihadis and the raiders, the Afridis, the Mahsuds, the Poonchi Muslims into India from Pakistan was orchestrated on Akbar Road. It was orchestrated in Jinnah's house by Akbar Khan, and thereafter 8,000 to 10,000 raiders were indoctrinated, and to my mind that was the first instance of a jihadi motivated infiltration into Kashmir. Well, it is a different matter that a large chunk of those raiders abandoned their jihadi inclinations and decided to plunder and loot in Baramulla, Rajouri and all those particular areas. But had we studied this infiltration campaign a little closer and a little more in detail during those days, we would have got the contours of Pakistan's proxy war that was unleashed on us in the late 80s. All this so-called proxy war that Pakistan has been waging with the ISI and with Mujahideen and things like that, the seeds of that were sown in 1947. It was attempted again in 1965 and then refined in the 1980s by Zia-ul Haq and converted into a really effective strategy against India from the late 80s and the early 90s onwards. The second lesson that we didn't learn, had we anticipated and studied this campaign, probably we would not have been caught napping. The third, this is a photograph of Major Thangaraj. Major Thangaraju was a Madras Engineering Group officer who was responsible for opening the road to Zojila Pass in 1948 that allowed tanks to go up and ensure that the raiders who had come up to Kargil and Dras do not overrun Leh and do not come up to Zojila Pass. Now, one of the main reasons why General Thimaya in 1948 could not go beyond Kargil and Dras and Leh and chase the raiders back towards Kardu and Gilgit was because of a lack of high altitude infrastructure. There were no roads. It was impassable. It was extremely difficult to navigate. We learned this lesson. We saw the amount of trouble that one engineer regiment took to just create tank tracks from Baltal up to Zojila Pass. And yet we did nothing about it, despite getting warnings in the 50s about the Chinese build-up in Aksai Chin and despite warnings by Sardar Patel and a whole lot of other people saying that there is a lot of build-up taking place in Aksai Chin. We need to be careful about what the Chinese are going to do. But no, there was no attempt at building up infrastructure, but instead of building up infrastructure, we decided to put in posts in inhospitable terrain that could not be sustained by either road or by tracks. and expected them to survive in the face of an absolutely brutal and hostile assault by the Chinese in great numbers. So the third lesson from the 1947 war that we didn't learn about the importance of creating infrastructure before you place troops. Now this is a photograph of Haji Pir Pass. Now Haji Pir Pass is in fact everyone knows over here, was recaptured by India in 1965 and then handed back after the Tashkent Declaration. And at that time it was a quid pro exchange, and I'm not debating or I'm not questioning the rationale for that. But giving back the Haji Pir Pass was a demonstration of our willingness, not our willingness to negotiate. Negotiations are an extremely vital element of diplomacy, and there can be no compromise on effective negotiations being the bedrock of interstate relations. But when negotiations lead to a certain amount of pain subsequently, it demonstrates a lack of intent. And I think giving Haji Pir Pass back and a number of areas in Tithwal and other things and other places in 1965 was a demonstration that India was willing to barter and trade rather than hold firm. And the last instance, which in hindsight we can say was something that could be excused, but is something that we need to remember, is that after all that wonderful orchestration of the 1971 war and the creation of Bangladesh, in one moment of magnanimity, Indira Gandhi agreed to drop the Kashmir issue from the Shimla Agreement and the resolution of the border issue. I mean to say, and Hussein Haqqani in his book has said that this was one moment in which Bhutto pleaded with Indira Gandhi, saying that please don't include Kashmir within the ambit of the Shimla Agreement. I promise you that when I go back to Pakistan and establish myself there, I will revisit. I will revisit the Kashmir issue and we will resolve it, I can assure you. It's now almost, 45 years down the line. We see no resolution in sight. I'm not saying that a border resolution at that time would have resulted in peace and tranquility. No, I'm not saying that. We could have continued to have conflict along the international border. But at least there would have been a defined international border between India and Pakistan, rather than a line of control or an NJ 9842 which led to the Siachen crisis. So that's all what I'm saying. Okay, a quick rush through. Any transparent look at a subject has to look inside also, and I'm looking inside the armed forces also. The armed forces also have been guilty of not paying sufficient attention to its own military history. None of our academies have a department of military history. Defense Services Staff College, which was set up in 1948, doesn't have a department of military history. At the National Defense College, we don't have a structured study of military history. Military history comes up in bits and pieces when we discuss strategy, when we discuss a particular issue. But the structured study of military history in the manner in which it is done with great dedication in the West is missing. What is the current kind of military history writing that we have in our country today? The books that I showed you earlier are not joint narratives. They are joined, which means to say first portion is Army, next portion is Navy, and the third portion is the Air Force. There is no fusion. What about our distinguished retired veterans and our soldiers, our senior officers? We have numerous accounts of battles, wars and campaigns fought since independence written by distinguished generals, admirals and air marshals, but they have all concentrated on a single service narrative or a single service description. No one except Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal, has written with authority about the other service. And we don't have any joint service narrative that Indians at large can read about. I mean, today if an Indian teenager says, Ariyar, I want to read about the 1971 war. What happened during the 1971 war? What was the Indian Air Force doing at a time when the Indian Army was operating in Shakargarh? Where was the Indian Navy? That young man wants to know. He wants to know in a concise narrative as to what the armed forces were doing together as one entity. We don't have any such narrative. And that's because there is little interest in cross-service history. Now, we in the armed forces we are developing a lot towards jointmanship to understand the other services' operational concepts. But not enough is being done to understand each other's histories, ethos and legacy. And as a result, this has had a direct impact on jointmanship. Okay, what are the perils of neglecting military history? The perils of neglecting military history is that we have a vast repository of veterans today who are in their 70s, 80s and 90s. There is a possibility in the decades to come that India may never fight a large-scale conventional war. We may fight limited, high-intensity, limited conflicts in different sectors. Does that mean once these people pass along, and if we don't have a narrative, does this mean that the next generation of Indians will not have anything about modern military history to read about from 1947 to current times? I think that's preposterous. Will it impact the military's attempt to stay relevant in a society that may not experience a full-scale war for decades? Of course. If we don't have an attractive narrative or if we don't have an interesting narrative, how will the youth of the country join the military? And in turn, will it impact our strategic culture? Well, I don't think I need to talk further about that. Lastly, the way ahead, I think we need a wider study of military history. We need a more transparent declassification policy. We need to improve our archival capability. And we need to not only institute professional military education reform, but I think large number of universities in India would need to shake hands with the military in order to create a military history narrative. We need departments of military history. And when I speak to a couple of professors, they say, we agree we need a department of military history. But where will these people who finish their post-graduation or MPhil in military history, what will they do later? Which means to say, we need to create opportunities for employment. Which means to say, like in Western military academies, we need large opportunities for civilian faculty to contribute to the academic discourse. Only then will we ensure a vibrant military history discourse in the country. Now with that, I hope I've been able to sort of evoke some interest in military history, and with that I rest my case and I think I'm open to questions. Thank you.